Excellent. Hey, everybody. How's it going? First day of reInvent going well so far? Whew, thank you. Thank you for attending. I know there's a lot of things on your schedule that are probably conflicting with this. You are our people. So thank you for prioritizing operations and incident management over all of those activities that are happening in the Expo Center right now. So this is the more valuable one by far. So just to get things started, this is not going to be a slide-heavy presentation. Nora and I are just going to be spending a lot of time talking about different concepts associated with AI and operations. So we're going to try and keep this a little bit more casual. So to set the stage, what we'd like to do is actually get a selfie with everybody in the room. So if everybody could just lean in a little bit, I'm going to use my extendable arm here and grab a picture of everybody real quick. All right, smile. Thanks, everybody. Excellent. All right.
Awesome.
Let's dive in.
Thanks, y'all. All right. So thank you again for coming. Like Tom said, we know this is the last session of the day, the first day of reInvent, and we are going to keep it fun. We've known each other for several years now, I think. And we've bonded over the topics that we're talking about today. And we thought the best way to do this is to kind of have, a great conversation about these topics like we like to do. So I'm Nora Jones. I am a VP of Product Development here at PagerDuty, and I'm joined today by Tom Lehman, who is VP of Site Reliability Engineering at one of our amazing customers, and who has been a fantastic partner to us at PagerDuty over the years, Warner Brothers Discovery.
Oh, thank you, Nora. Like Nora mentioned, Tom Lehman, VP of Site Reliability Engineering. Just to level set, because I think everybody has their own definition of site reliability engineering, what that translates into at Warner Brothers Discovery is that our SRE teams handle all of the engineering solutions for what we consider proactive and reactive reliability, database reliability, FinOps, and site reliability operations, which is our incident management and analytics function. And we support HBO Max, Discovery Plus, TNT, you name it, any of our DTC, direct-to-consumer products, that happens to be within the bounds of site reliability engineering at WBD.
Amazing. And today we're going to be having a conversation around, a favorite topic that's happening right now, which is AI-driven automation for modern operations. We've spoken a lot as an industry, and we've been using AI over the past several years now, and it's really escalated recently. But we want to talk today about how we can leverage it a little bit more in operations and within resiliency and reliability. We talk about how it impacts reliability a lot, but how can we leverage it to our advantage when we are in some of these emergency situations, or even when we're in the context of more well-understood situations as well. And so I know Tom has gone on a lot of a journey with this, even within Warner Brothers Discovery. You've been there for 4 years now, and you've done a huge technology shift internally too, which we'll get into in a little bit. But even within PagerDuty, we've been working with a lot of our customers for a long time now, and we're seeing how the folks that are adopting AI and automation are resolving and responding to incidents better and more confidently than folks that are not leaning into it as much. So for example, in 2025, we saw that enterprises increased their use of PagerDuty AI and automation actually had a faster incident resolution time by about 2.8x, which ended up totaling to over 6 hours in 2025. And part of the reason I'm so excited to talk with Tom today is Warner Brothers has been a great partner to us over the years. We've changed as a company, the industry's changes, and Warner Brothers has changed as well. And we've been really working together to help you stay resilient and to help us build a platform that matters. So first of all, thank you for that. I'm curious, if you could get into some of the shifts that you have been experiencing recently at Warner Brothers, even starting with when you joined.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take a trip down memory lane, go back to about 2022, 2023, around when Discovery Communications and Warner Media merged together. There was a decision that was made that we would end up launching a net new streaming application called Max, now HBO Max. There was also an HBO Max back then. you've been through the journey with us. I won't talk about that anymore. As a part of that process, we had about a 9-month deadline to create and build this net new streaming application. And the intention was that we weren't just going to take one of our pre-existing products, whether it was the Discovery Plus streaming application or HBO Max as it stood then, and then rebrand it. Instead, we thought this was a great opportunity to establish a stronger consistency with our technical platform and engage engineers, operators, product TPMs in standardized processes across our organizations. So effectively what we did was we built this platform as a best of both worlds, taking lessons learned from both locations and aligning on a similar technology stack. I'm not going to go into the details of the architecture, that's not the topic of this conversation, but a core part of what we did back then was understand and align on how we would describe our system. Probably one of the most foundational concepts that we came up with at that point in time was the operational metadata schema. And this was a standardized approach by which we catalog our services and systems throughout the entirety of the software development lifecycle so that we could easily understand from the point of a repository being created, we could understand the hierarchy of business functions represented within that repository through the CI/CD pipelines to our deployed infrastructure, services, metrics, logs, and eventually incidents handled in PagerDuty. We would carry through that metadata that would identify the business function like consumer, commerce, playback capabilities, down to the microservice that it ended up tying back to. This gives us really great traceability when it comes to handling an incident, when handling operations, handling things like FinOps and metering across the board. Beyond that, which was very much almost a vertical Conway's Law setup, many of our organizations were set up in a similar fashion. We had this concept that we created called the critical user journey. And these were horizontal slices of functionality that were most important to our customers. Things like playing back video, the ability to log in, being able to browse and search. So we were able to map many of these components and microservices to those customer user journeys. This helped us prioritize our work, how we would classify incidents, and effectively drove a lot of our work within the operations space.
What I'm also hearing a lot of in there is just, you had these two applications and then you were building another application, but you also had two cultures that you were merging, and then you were co-creating a third culture while launching this application. And I'm also, I've been through this, we've all been through a lot of this. Unless you're explicitly putting it out there, there are different assumptions around what reliability means, what the most important business value is. And you might have actually been experiencing that with even these two different cultures. And so what I like about this operational metadata concept is it's like helping create that common vernacular. Who did you have in the room when you were having these conversations?
Yeah, so it was folks from across technology, product, business that were all involved, especially as we were defining those critical user journeys. Because at the end of the day, you need the buy-in from folks that are outside of the technology space to be able to actually provide input on what we think those most important functions are going to be, and then back that up with data as well. So this was actually a very welcome conversation across the board, that by proactively engaging these groups outside of engineering in the process of operations, it helped us get to common ground as far as how we talk about incidents and operations and priorities across the board.
Amazing. And so this actually is a great segue into some of how we've been talking about different archetypes that we might experience. And if we take it at a high level, we can think of operational situations fitting into one of three archetypes, or maybe a mix of two. We have new and novel situations, which we've all experienced a lot of, and these will only increase as we add new technology and add new complexity and businesses grow, which are brand new situations which require a human being to put their expert attention into it. We have partially understood situations which, seem kind of familiar. Maybe we haven't seen it in a long time. Maybe the people that dealt with it are not at the organization anymore. And then we also have well understood situations. These are things that, get us pulled into, day in and day out, but they shouldn't require a human being to necessarily interrupt their workflow. And so what you were kind of dealing with this new app that you were launching in 9 months was sort of this new and novel situation, which requires a lot of communication as well. Can you talk about how that got developed?
Yeah, so a lot of it boils down to investment in that foundation, because the more that you can document, the more conversations that you can have, the more of that foundation that you can build up, like with the operational metadata, the CUJs coming to those types of alignments, the fewer situations you'll run into that are the new and novel domain. And when you are in the new and novel space, you can leverage a combination of things like automation, artificial intelligence, standardized ways by which you're organizing your information to be able to disambiguate and find some insights to be able to suss out some of those new and novel situations itself.
And you've sort of codified what is important to the business and are helping folks that are on the ground resolving the incidents understand it, but helping the business sort of form that alignment with them as well. How do you see that model evolving with AI, and how do you see AI playing a part in helping folks understand, the operational model?
Oh, absolutely. So I think there's a really, really solid opportunity, and we're even leveraging it internally as well, is pointing agents at those types of knowledge bases, whether it happened to be the OMD service catalog that we happen to have that provides this listing of all of the different business functions, capabilities, and microservices, to runbooks that are stored in standardized locations referencing that OMD taxonomy. LLM agents that are pointed at that information can then be used by a wide range of personas to gain a better understanding of what your system happens to be. And no more of an important time is there than in the middle of an incident to be able to get that type of context. Because not every single engineer in our organization is going to be able to understand the entire distributed system, all of our business functions across the board, but what agents provide is a quick and easy tool to be able to provide that access at their fingertips versus trolling through hundreds of wiki pages or dozens of dashboards.
Which takes a lot of time when you're trying to stop the bleeding and get back to a customer's experience as quickly as possible. Has anyone in the room been in the middle of an incident or, before an incident started and everyone's kind of debating what sev level it is, or if it is even an incident? Has that ever happened to folks? Yeah, I feel like it's a pretty common thing and it keeps happening. And so what I like about the approach you're taking is it's evolving with the folks, but it's also giving them someone to gut check with, and that is kind of an agent in those situations.
Absolutely, and we've started to see some success with that already. Recently, within the past couple of weeks, actually, we just released into an internal beta in our site reliability operations team a incident severity classification agent. So by providing a lightweight description, you can feed that into the agent, and it will actually reference a lot of our documentation associated with severity matrices. Now, pretty much everybody in the room raised their hand earlier about being in a debate about incident severity. I'm going to ask for some participation here. Why? Why do people debate severity? Shouldn't it be clear-cut? You can just point to a metric or a measure? Absolutely. So just to repeat back for folks that are viewing remotely or on the recording, one of the questions or one of the contributing factors can be lack of documentation or lack of awareness of documentation, or potentially even substantially robust documentation that nobody's going to be able to actually parse and understand in the middle of an incident. Right?
Or even know where it is or what to look up in some of those situations as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I know, we've got another raised hand back there. Yeah, so the response there was we may have different capabilities that are used by smaller subsets of customers versus an entire product application. Certainly in the context of HBO Max, if playback is not working, that is an absolutely critical issue. If a smaller used functionality isn't working, then that might be a lower severity issue. Now, one thing that we have to think about within WBD is we support so many different product lines that Something that would be a Sev1 for one of our product lines may not be the same scale as what we see on HBO Max, right? It's not going to reach a, hey, we can't play back video at 9 p.m. Eastern on a Sunday night for whether it be Task or Welcome to Derry or House of the Dragon, right?
Yeah, and I think that, and what you had brought up earlier was like a lot of this is alignment, right? And then when you're in the middle of an incident and you know that something is down, time is precious, right? And fumbling for docs versus sometimes trusting your expertise is a decision that's being weighed. And I think a lot of what you're doing and a lot of how we've seen you utilizing and revolutionizing some of your operations is to make that discernment easier for folks, no matter where they sit in the organization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so kind of going back to the example that I gave with the agent that we just deployed recently, one huge investment that we've put in over the past couple of months is those types of collaborations with folks across the board where we've had conversations with key business leaders and key engineering leaders across each of our CUJs to really suss out exactly what incident classifications could be within their particular domain. So for playback, if this happens to be the impact, or this subset of users, or this platform, or there's a regulatory issue, or there happens to be an issue associated with our observability platform or deployment pipelines. And we were able to work through and collaborate with folks because everybody understood what was in it for them, because it removes that level of debate. It removes that level of lack of trust in the process, because you can actually see it coming together. Now, after we put all of that together, we ended up with spreadsheets that were hundreds of rows long. And the immediate reaction was, going back to it, the documentation's too long. No one's going to be able to parse it, but that's where the agent comes in. Because an agent can parse it, it can actually derive that value, and it can get it to you right in the middle of an incident without much of a problem at all.
Right. And I'm sure that also, even if you have new people on the team, that likely can ramp them up more quickly so that you have more expertise in the mix as well.
Oh, absolutely. And let me take a backtrack real quick. There was a quote that I heard as far as leveling someone up when it comes to an understanding of architecture. How many of you have been onboarded or helped onboard a person and sent them a list of around 15 to 20 wiki pages and architecture diagrams to get up to speed? I see smiles, I see nods. We have all been there. Yes. And then they go on a retreat, hibernate, and then after winter is over, they get thrown at their first incident, and the first thing they do is page a senior engineer because they don't know how the system actually operates. But you throw someone in that incident up front, they're going to learn real fast.
Right.
Sure, they should have some help. They should have some hand-holding. You don't want somebody that's responding to a Sev1 actually taking the reins if they're just straight out of college, something along those lines. But you equip them in those positions, whether it's through an actual live incident, whether you're recreating an incident with fault injection in a lower level environment. You equip them with an agent that also has the information at its fingertips of past incidents, run books, all of this information, and that individual can get up to speed and understand the context of what's going on much, much faster. It's effectively training wheels for when they're actually going live and working independently as on-call engineers and operators.
And as an industry, for the last several years, I think we've all been in companies where we've experienced a major incident, and as much as you try to avoid it, there are like 3 people you know that you want in the room helping you, right? And I think what we're seeing as an industry and how we're evolving is that we can kind of remove knowledge silos a little bit. We're disseminating knowledge a little bit more readily and leveling everybody up together rather than leveling up people in individual knowledge silos, which can ultimately help our businesses. I think one of the things that so I was listening to your podcast with Werner Vogel around the frugal architect, and one of the things that you said on there really stuck out to me because I think it's so important to keep in context is that we are doing reliability, not just for the sake of reliability, not just for the sake of keeping databases up, but for the customer experience and for customer trust. And so it sounds like your operational model actually helps, disseminate customer trust all the way down to what that means on a service level as well. And so I feel like that's very important to keep in mind around, how you architect your processes too. And so you were mentioning a little bit about Sev 1s and Sev 2s and how they follow certain processes. Could you double click into what the process is for a Sev 1?
Yeah, so before diving into Sev 1s, why don't we talk a little bit more about just severities in general?
Sure.
The way that we operate, we have 4 severity classifications at Warner Brothers. Sev 1s and Sev 2s are the most critical. Sev 1s happen to be significant outages. Sev 2s, we know a CUJ happens to be impacted in some way, shape, or form for a subset of our client base. 3s and 4s tend to be more very, very small customer impact, if not no customer impact. So these could be situations where you may have high memory utilization or CPU utilization. You should probably look into it, but the customer experience is in a good space in those situations. So based on that severity classification, we'll actually handle those differently. So we track our time to acknowledge and time to mitigate measures very, very closely for all of our incidents. And for each severity type, we have different SLAs associated with each of those types of measures. So time to acknowledge may be a little bit more lenient for Sev 3s and Sev 4s. For Sev 2s and Sev 1s, it's extremely short. For time to mitigate, again, those numbers come down pretty substantially. But also the expectations associated with the process will evolve based on that severity classification. 3s and 4s are largely landed with the engineering teams. And one thing we didn't talk about yet is our culture of incident operations at WBD. We have very much the you build it, you run it function. So while we do have groups like the Site Reliability Operations team, which is there for every incident to facilitate, ensure that folks are following the process appropriately, we expect engineers that commit code and develop the software to actually respond to the pages and be a core part of the mitigation of any type of incident impacting their services. So for Sev 3s and Sev 4s, the SRO doesn't get involved. Effectively, that's an engineering-only function. Typically, teams aren't paged for that, although for Sev 3s, we give them the opportunity to if they think that those could potentially become customer impacting down the road. Sev 2s, these, again, are tied back to some customer impact associated with our CUJs or some critical function like legal, regulatory, or something that would impact developer productivity and back office functions. Those will involve the Site Reliability Operations team. They will facilitate the process, page folks in, will handle things like stakeholder notifications, note-taking, the administration of our PagerDuty incident tickets to make sure that things are in good order as we're going through the incident itself, and when we close the incident out, we've got the appropriate metadata associated with it. For Sev 1s, we add on an additional layer of expectation as a part of that process. Not only are our time windows much shorter on our SLAs, but we actually kick in what we call the technical call leader rotation, which is a dedicated response group of VP and up leaders. So these are individuals that are involved in providing executive level communications across the organization, as well as handling things like business decisions and things along those lines. So as we go through those severity levels, we ratchet up the expectations, the responsibilities, and the folks that get involved.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you can leverage agents, or you are leveraging agents to help with managing some of those expectations depending on the situation someone is in.
Absolutely. So when we're looking at a Sev 2, for instance, there is a very solid opportunity to utilize agents for things like those status updates, right? So in the middle of an incident, things are complicated, right? We're getting hit by changing metrics, changing logs, context from DMs that are coming from the side, channel conversations in the chat that was spun up specifically for the incident. You may have a video conferencing bridge that's set up as well. There's a lot of information, and being able to discern that into a well-structured update that stakeholders across the organization can understand is no small feat. So one area that we're looking at and have lightly utilized so far is using agents to parse through certain subsets of that data, a combination of context from conversations as well as some of our operational data to inform the details of those status updates. This significantly decreases the toil from our operators and reduces the amount of task switching that's necessary in the middle of an incident. And this is certainly beneficial when we're dealing with a situation where we have to do executive communications, for instance. So being able to tie in automation and agents to be able to summarize the nitty-gritty details of a technology incident such that it's understandable across multiple business contexts is an absolute game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned because executives aren't always involved in every incident, but SREs are, and so sometimes when it goes into a new process, it's like you haven't practiced it in a while, right? And so it sounds like leveraging agents to give you a leg up to remember what executives need in a situation, remember what your customer service folks need in a situation. Like you've brought up to me before, we have our external customers, right? And it's, their experience and their trust matters, but we also sometimes in incidents have internal customers as well that need to know what's going on to keep the lights on and to keep things going.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the model that you introduced before, no matter what type of incident you're dealing with, you're always going to have that well understood work. Mm-hmm. What I was talking about before with those status updates, those are well understood pieces of work. You know that your stakeholders are going to expect messages every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, and there's a synthesis process associated with that.
Right.
But beyond that well understood work, where agents typically are able, sometimes you can hand the reins over to the agent as long as you have a person saying, yes, that's an appropriate message to send an executive or to stakeholders. There's also the concept of how agents can better inform the incident response of the responders, the operators, the engineers, when they don't have much context associated with the incident or the functionality that they're dealing with. Again, I'm going to lean into that. WBD has a very complicated ecosystem from a business as well as a technology perspective. So being able to keep track of every single release, every product function that goes live is not something that any engineer or any leader is able to parse through or keep in their memory short-term cache. But an agent can. Mm-hmm. It can use retrieval augmented generation. It can pull in information from your wiki docs. So we've been in situations where we've been managing incidents, and it is very, very easy to turn to an agent and ask questions about some of what is being talked about in the case that you aren't familiar with the discussion topic. We had recently launched a capability called, limited free experience. And I wasn't super familiar with that on the line. And the acronym was being used because who doesn't love a good acronym? So it was LFE, and it was some of the first times that I had heard it. And immediately I start seeing the acronym that I didn't understand, turned to my handy-dandy agent, and it immediately gave me back a report that provided information on the capability in that circumstance to be able to actually help better understand. That helped me provide a better impact on the incident itself. So a lot of good opportunities, whether we're talking about not well understood to very, very well understood.
And I think you brought up a good point, like we could be in a new and novel situation, but part of the resolution of that could be well understood, maybe like how we need to provide status updates to folks. And so it's not necessarily, and if we're looking at this whole life cycle that we see on the screen, it's not necessarily that everything needs to fall under one archetype. It's that, part of these things could be helped with agents. I'm curious, if we're thinking about, on the left side of this diagram, the build, test, and deploy, when we're building a new capability, I guess like when you're starting that out and when you're scoping it and when you're checking things into code, you might have an idea in your head that something could be a Sev1 later or a critical service later. How do you bring your operational model schema directly into the beginning of that life cycle as well?
Yeah, thankfully, we have some incredibly talented engineers on our platform engineering team such that you can't get a repository without actually defining what some of the operational metadata is associated with it, especially the business function and taxonomy associated with it. That's normally something that engineers, leaders are capable of doing relatively independently as long as you aren't creating naming conflicts, and we never have those in engineering either. But when it comes down to functional impact, so can this create a Sev1? Can this create a Sev2? How does it tie into the rest of our ecosystem? That might not be completely understood when a repository is being created. At WBD, we have a application tiering mechanic whereby we tier each and every microservice that happens to come through, tier 1 to tier 4. Tier 1, similar to Sev1s, happen to be the most business critical. And they're typically our services that are tied directly to those CUJs. And tier 1 services are capable of creating those Sev1s across the organization. Tier 2s, loose impact may be in the path of a CUJ, but not exactly critical path. So they may go down, they may do what we call fail open, so that it won't have customer impact in those situations. And then tier 3, tier 4 are typically back office or non-customer facing functionalities. What we do on a regular basis is we will actually do a bit of an auditing associated with that tiering. And a lot of it ties back to those CUJs. We have load tests and fault injection test automation associated with those CUJs, and we will execute those on a regular basis to make sure that we've got a clear mapping of the components and microservices that tie back to each CUJ. This gives us a good understanding whereby we can check, oh, hey, now we've got a tier 3 service that's now showing up as a part of the call path for our CUJ. We need to reclassify this as a part of that process, and then change its alerting structure and mechanics for being able to create and triage incidents when they end up getting set off and set off alerts.
I'm sure many of us in the room have had a surprise my service is critical situation in the midst of an incident. So I like that this is, being automated a little bit more to provide that context, because as you said, no human being can keep all of this in their head. And so it's a nice way to supplement it so that we can run faster. So let's say that, we are getting into an incident, right? We've released a capability, we've defined everything correctly, and we're getting into an incident. We realize it's an incident, right? So if it works cleanly, we have detect, triage, diagnosing, repairing, and learning from the incident. But it's not linear. They all kind of, work together. Maybe you think you've repaired it, and you're actually diagnosing a new incident at the same time. You all have leveraged a lot of new PagerDuty capabilities throughout this life cycle recently. Could you dive into what's been most interesting to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll hit on a few different points and try to tie it back to some of the life cycle of the incident management process itself. So up at the very forefront, I don't know if this is necessarily a completely new capability within PagerDuty, but a big value add that we get is with the PagerDuty noise reduction capability. This is something that all of our services get by default. And by and large, most of our developers probably don't even know that it exists. And that's how good it happens to be. For every service that exists, microservice, we have a technical service in PagerDuty. And each of those technical services will automatically merge alerts from that microservice if they happen to meet existing criteria. So if it happens to be very similarly named alerts that come in, same summary, same description, it'll automatically condense those into a singular incident, because no operator or engineer wants to be opening up their phone to acknowledge 15 different incidents that have all stemmed from the exact same alert path over the past 3 minutes or so. So that has been a huge boon. We've seen about a 40 to 50% reduction in incident creation due to that noise reduction process. So big value add up front. Going into some of the other capabilities, again, just from the detection point of view, we've leveraged the operational dashboard? The
Ops console. Operations console.
Operations console. This provides a near real-time refreshing view of filtered incidents. It's something that we've leveraged pretty heavily associated with major launches. These are situations where you're probably going to have not just engineering, but product, business folks that may be interested in understanding the health and well-being of the new capabilities that are going live. And the operations console gives us the ability to easily filter to pre-described data sets associated with incidents, and then give those to groups across the board during these critical launch windows so that you can find out if we're launching HBO Max in a new country in EMEA. We can find all the incidents that pertain to that just based on the title or description or metadata associated with that incident. So we've seen a lot of value with that. The third item that I'll talk about is custom fields, which I know is a fairly recent capability within PagerDuty. This has been something that we've been clamoring for a bit because we always want to be able to add additional metadata to our incident tickets themselves. Because we find that we're very, very analytics and data-driven at WBD. So the more metadata that we can attach to those incidents and then gain insights into over time, the more learnings that we can gather and the more we can do to make our systems more reliable at the end of the day. So we've utilized those custom fields to track things like blast radius. We automate the count of customer support tickets that are associated with a particular incident. And we also leverage it as a control mechanism to kick off advanced workflows that in the case that somebody, for instance, wants to escalate an incident to a Sev1, we make sure that we've got enough data within those custom fields to actually assure that it is a Sev1. Like I mentioned, we've got a lot of extra processes and practices associated with that. So we don't want to be in a position where an individual developer or somebody with the ability to create a new incident jumps it up to a Sev1 because they think it's a support request and they want high priority because that's going to trigger an executive or VP to get onto a line, executive communications go out, et cetera. So we've leveraged a combination of those advanced workflows as well as the custom fields to make that happen.
Okay. Yeah, and what I like about that too is, you were bringing up earlier around in some incidents there might be folks DMing or calling people or clamoring for information. And so this puts some of that whiteout in the open, right? And so that they're all operating under kind of a source of truth as much as possible and asking questions that align with what's going on in the middle of a situation as well.
Without a doubt. This has been a big part of some of the cultural shift that we have within WBD is that the PagerDuty ticket, the notes, the information that happened to be in there is the source of truth for our incident. So if the information isn't there, then it's not something that's associated with the timeline of the incident. It's not the relevant information. We'll certainly source information from Slack, but we're not going to point a net new leader or developer and say, hey, go read through the reams of Slack documentation that happened to be there. Instead, go to the PagerDuty ticket, and that's where you'll be able to get the information that you need.
And we touched a little bit on this in the beginning, but you've had to do a lot of cultural changes around this as well. And as businesses grow and as businesses come together, that, will keep evolving. I'm curious how, you mentioned you involved different stakeholders in the room, but how did you help engineering and teams understand how their definition of reliability was changing and evolving, and maybe how their processes might be changing and evolving too?
So it's always a difficult problem to solve, to convince people to do a thing that you want them to do when they're very happy with what they happen to be doing, right? So the big thing there is the what's in it for me, right? The more that we can translate our message and what we're looking to do into things that will help those teams out, drive value, reduce toil, those are the ways that we get those wins. So typically what we'll do is we'll find business partners, engineering partners that'll be those early adopters. They're incentivized or understand, hey, I can see the value in what you're trying to accomplish here to start the snowball effect to get folks on board. So when it came to a lot of the changes for technology and commonalities associated with processes, even though we had engineers, process leaders, business leaders that had very different opinions across the board, we were able to get some of those folks up front that understood, hey, at the end of the day, if we all march to the same drumbeat and row in the same direction, we're going to be able to accomplish a lot more, and it's going to be better off not only for me as an individual, but also the broader organization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the what's in it for me framing it. What were patterns you were looking for with those early partners that told you that they would be more incentivized to try this out with you and sort of partner with you?
Ideally, some excitement. So sometimes there are just some folks that are just general early adopters. So
Sure.
I don't have Sorry. I don't have favorites for anybody at WBD that happens to watch this at another point in time. But certainly within an organization, you'll be able to find some folks that typically want to be at the forefront of net new capabilities, new functionality, and processes that can get on board and provide honest feedback. That's something that's critical. You don't just want folks that are there to be, yes, I want to be an early adopter, I'm never going to provide you any feedback, and whatever ends up going through, this is great because I can add it to my resume or I can add it to my delivery and performance review at the end of the year. That's not the point. You want folks that are early adopters that can also provide good feedback on what you're trying to accomplish so that your process or your technology ends up actually becoming better through their involvement. And thankfully at WBD, we've got a number of different service teams that we've been able to make that work with on a regular basis.
Amazing. We've talked a lot about this life cycle in context to a new and novel incident and a Sev1. But what about when it is a little bit more well understood? You've mentioned reducing toil and how you're leveraging some of our products to do that right now. But I'm curious, how you see this cycle working in a more well understood situation and the role that you see agents playing or how you're even using them now.
Yeah, so I've talked a lot about different agent interplays in our incident management lifecycle now. So whether it happened to be the filtration through noise reduction, to the additional context and understanding, to the, maybe I didn't mention it, but the automation of status updates as well, those all factor into that lifecycle. I think if I were to broadcast out by 3, 6, maybe 12 months out, almost seeing a fully AI-landed incident management lifecycle whereby an incident is automatically identified through alerts, threshold-driven incident management, incident generation, to status updates being generated automatically. And then you end up having people still in the middle, mostly for that thumbs up of, hey, this looks good, to make sure things that move through. When it comes to mitigations to me are still in a little bit of a scary space, right? I don't think anyone here is going to give an agent kubectl access with admin credentials right off the bat, right? Maybe not. Many of you may be much more daring than I am, but it's certainly not something that I would necessarily hand directly to an agent. Now, if you happen to have workflows that are well defined, that may be in your operational toolkit, that you can hand off to the agent, whereby this is a safe action and it happens to have appropriate guardrails set up, that would be a good place to start. Just giving admin and full create, update, delete capabilities, dangerous domain at this point. So what we're doing is actually investing a lot in what those workflows are right now for things like being able to shift traffic between regions, for being able to restart pods and things along those lines.
It's interesting. I don't know if any of the folks in the room were like, yeah, I would do that to his question, but I think people internally and people across different companies might also have different interpretations of what is risky versus what is not risky to have an agent help with. And I'm curious, you talk about customer trust with in relation to reliability and customer experience, but how do you think we can internally, and how do you internally help people build trust with the agents to know which actions should be taken versus which should be left to the human?
Well, I think the good news is that assuming that you have an application or systems that have been in production for a while and have had a history of incidents in the past, unless you're a startup that hasn't launched yet, you're going to be there at some point in time, right? We all have a huge test bed, effectively, that we can point agents at, and we can do back testing associated with that too. So as I've been talking through these different agentic solutions that we're utilizing internally, many of those we have then utilized internally and pointed at historical incidents to validate, do they provide the same response as what we did as a part of that incident? So that severity classification matrix agent that I was talking about before. Before getting started with that, we ran through a number of different incidents that were submitted by customer support, by a product, by other engineers, and parsed that into the agent and then validated, did it come out with a severity that we eventually landed at? Mm-hmm. Similarly, you have different types of status updates and information. incident history is something that we all have, and most of us have a very durable data set that you can play with. So you can leverage that to your advantage with building that trust in the agent, because you can tweak the agent. You can adjust the prompts and the instruction set that's associated with them to improve that accuracy as much as you're comfortable with.
So when you do start building trust, and I imagine the trust will increase over time, it might decrease in certain areas depending on, the new and novel situations that we run into. How do you see, the post-incident review process playing a role in that world?
Yeah, so this is an area that I'm really, really excited about, because I think we've got a huge opportunity for leveraging agents in not only the generation of post-incident reviews, but also in adjustments to those agents based on those incident reviews themselves. So let's dive into maybe the opportunity for the post-incident review first. You mentioned it multiple times already. Incidents are complicated. Creating status updates are complicated. Creating an incident review for something that took about an hour and a half to resolve, incredibly complicated. One of the most valuable things that you can do as a part of an incident review process is construct a timeline, an accurate timeline of what was happening. And that can be very, very tough, because you're relying on humans to reconstruct information based on historical metrics, logs, conversations, you name it. You throw an agent at that history, at a transcript, at that information, it can print out and create a timeline very quickly for you. And something that would have taken an operator or engineer hours and hours to create, an agent can crank it out in a minute or so, right? So huge value in being able to do that and unearth a lot of learning that people just won't be able to do themselves, because you've got a short-term cache, and that short-term cache can become corrupt, and you can misremember, you can misunderstand, and not fully see how things panned out, but an agent will actually pull through a lot of the information, assuming that you have that information handy. And it can also point out things that you might not have understood to begin with. So this is an area that we are investing in being able to pull in some of this information, whether it be through transcripts, whether it be through chat logs, et cetera, to synthesize that timeline, to be able to better understand what happened during an incident. And we found that that has been very beneficial, especially for some of our most severe and most complicated incidents so far. Now, the additional benefit is being able to then turn that reflection back on the agents. Because as you're going back and you're utilizing agents for your incident response process, you'll also want to use that post-incident review to understand how you can improve your agents. Again, going back to tweaking of prompts, being able to understand, did we get the same status update that we wanted as a part of this output? Was it recommending the remediation that we expected at the end of the day? So big benefit in that space too.
Yeah, and even, taking those learnings into the beginning of the software development lifecycle as well, even before an incident takes place, just to have some of that context, I could see being useful.
Absolutely. One of the first use cases that we explored was actually pointing an agent to our historical post-incident review report library. We've got dozens of those, and we wanted to better understand systemic issues. Typically, when folks go into a post-incident review, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, I've done that like 12 times so far during this, but most of you have probably been in a situation where you've got blinders on, right? Where you're focused on this incident. You may not be thinking about an incident that happened a week ago or 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, or potentially an incident in a completely different business domain. Oh, but there's a connection between them. There's some similarities. So what we started doing early on was pointing agents toward this incident review library to tease out what are some of these commonalities. One of the questions that we asked was, why aren't we auto-detecting as many incidents as we want? We have too many manually detected incidents. So what the agent was able to do was actually parse through hundreds of incident reports and was able to unearth through the unstructured narratives that folks had provided to indicate that, hey, it isn't because we aren't alerting on 500 errors or latency metrics or anything along those lines, but we were actually running into a lot of novel situations where we would have what would be considered appropriate business reactions that were inappropriately placed. We were hiding a UI element when we shouldn't have. It wasn't an error scenario, it was just an inappropriate use of a particular requirement in that circumstance. So what we were able to do was take that back and then start thinking about how do we translate those requirements into a stronger error signal? And are there areas where we could potentially have mismatched requirements where we aren't generating a 500 or an error log in those scenarios? So those were some of the ways that we were able to take some value out of that.
How did you, with the patterns that you saw and the opportunities for improvement, how did you prioritize some of those changes?
Yeah, so a big part of what we do within our operational excellence program is we run a weekly operational excellence business review, where we'll actually reflect on all of our operational measures, whether it's time to mitigate, time to acknowledge, auto detection rate, but we also use this as an opportunity to share operational learnings across our engineering organization, because we have members of our service development teams from across the board present during these. So at the very end of some of these sessions, we would share the learnings, we would drive the action items, we would then align these to typically the actual celebration or post-incident review processes. And those action items, we actually have SLAs that are defined for when they are expected to be completed. So we were able to roll that into the operational excellence program itself, attach them as action items to COEs, and then let the process take it off from there.
Awesome. What are you've talked about a few things that you are doing with agents in your operations, and you talked about a few things that are going to be going forward. What are you most excited about on your AI roadmap?
Yeah, so I think going back to the ability to have agents interface with all of our data sets and to an extent run an incident almost on autopilot, going back to what I was saying before. Getting to a point where post-incident detection, an agent can quickly analyze your observability data. Let's say that's one agent pointed toward MCP servers for things like Amazon Managed Prometheus, OpenSearch, another that happens to be pointed to data points associated with recent deployments, another pointed to data for previous post-incident reviews and runbooks. You effectively have your own mini operations team at your disposal.
Yeah.
And you just need a human in the loop to make sure that there's no goofiness that's happening in the mix. But that's no different than what we do with people today, right? We have individuals that are looking at the operational data. They have their own context. They have their own understanding of what's happening. And you still have these coordination pieces. So agents help step in and help out as a part of that process too.
Amazing. Well, we've had a lot of discussion today around how we can leverage AI and automation more readily in our operations, especially when we've had organizations that have been around for a long time too, and we have maybe developed things that didn't use that, right? And so we're evolving over time. And so if we had to summarize today, some of the key things I think you shared were, one of them were pointing LLMs towards your history, right? Towards your previous incidents and your process in order to build trust, but also some of this might not be visible to the human eye, and it might help point to things that we might not be recognizing, which it sounds like you did in the last example you gave.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a treasure trove of learning that you all are already sitting on. I can guarantee you that. And if you start pointing agents to that, they can help you unearth that. And going back to that example that I gave you, it would have taken hours, days, frankly, for an analyst to parse through all of that information themselves. We were able to do that effectively in an hour, right? So huge benefit in that space, right?
And a key thing throughout our entire conversation today was the foundational data set that you invested in right at the very beginning, and how imperative that is to even be able to use AI so that you are getting quality outputs and aligning folks around that, and that can actually end up increasing the frequency of being in well-understood situations rather than treating them as if they're new and novel and interrupting people's time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, structure and organization makes things more efficient, not just for humans, but also artificial intelligence and automation as well. So establishing that foundation, building that vernacular and classification capability, while some may say it's boring, I love it, I'm a nerd in that way, it is something that pays off dividends at the end of the day.
Yeah, it helps everyone run more smoothly and probably develop, not just resolve incidents more quickly, but develop things more quickly as well, because you're operating under a baseline expectation that is, roughly the same. And a lot of folks already have current incident processes that they're using and maybe evolving, and you did as well, right? So and you had mentioned using agents to reduce context switching and coordination costs, like using agents to maybe catch up on what's going on with the situation or remember the processes to follow as well. How would you recommend others think about that?
Yeah, so I would take a look at your incident lifecycle and see what are the points where you are seeing the most toil, the things that are distracting from the point of mitigation, right? Top priority has to be mitigate the incident. Those are things like communication. Those are things like that individual or leader that joins the bridge and asks for a status update that brings everything to a screeching halt. Right? The more you can put agents and automation in play to be able to mitigate that and keep folks focused with their eyes on the prize, the better off. So I think for many companies, you've got this opportunity to start pointing agents to those conversations, point agents toward that data, point agents toward those incident reviews from past history to be able to provide input and start chipping away at the toil that's associated with the incident management lifecycle.
Amazing. Well, we have about 3 minutes left, so we probably have time for some questions if folks have any for Tom or about some of what we've been implementing.
This is so exciting. We are we're actually in the process of rolling out a new service health framework across all of our applications. This is a standardized way of being able to author service level objectives across our microservices, their infrastructure, and then roll that up to the CUJ level as well. Because our end goal is to be able to understand the historical health and well-being of everything from the level of customer impact all the way to the smallest level of microservice at the end of the day. So the framework enables us to define quite simply like what are healthy responses, what are unhealthy responses, and then being able to use that, create percentage-based dials associated with those service level objectives. Based on the mapping to the CUJs and the tiering of the services, that would then correlate back into automated incident severity generation in those situations. So, tier 1 service that's attached to our playback capability, if it's violating its SLO, Sev 2, potential easy escalation up to a Sev 1 in that circumstance.
All right, well, we are at time, but thank you so much, Tom, for your time today and for your partnership in general. Really appreciate it, and thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you.